Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's live discussion with Ahmed Shaheed, United Nations Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Religion or Belief.
Hello, everyone. I'm Dan Mariaschin, CEO of B'nai B'rith International. Thank you for being with us today. I'm joined by David Michaels, B'nai B'rith International's Director of United Nations and Intercommunal Affairs, and we want to welcome you to an important conversation with Ahmed Shaheed, the UN's Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Religion or Belief and former Foreign Minister of the Maldives. Just as the world body's Human Rights Council has convened for its main yearly session. Like every year, only this time during pandemic conditions, virtually, B'nai B'rith is leading Jewish communal engagement at the United Nations, especially at the Human Rights Council. We've maintained a one-of-a-kind accredited presence at the UN since its founding 75 years ago in the ashes of World War II and the Holocaust. It was precisely because of these horrors that B'nai B'rith and the organized Jewish community have been so deeply invested in the United Nations so that such atrocities might be prevented from ever recurring. Sadly, of course, violent hatred against Jews or others did not disappear with the founding of the UN, even with its lofty aspirations. But just over a year ago, Dr. Shaheed made a highly unusual and highly substantial contribution to tackling bigotry and discrimination in the form of a first ever UN report on global anti-Semitism. B'nai B'rith took part in consultations and made submissions during the report's development. And while much more remains to be said and done, we are deeply appreciative of the hard work and real collaboration that went into Dr. Shaheed's report. Today, we have the opportunity, 1 year on, to speak with Dr. Shaheed about the findings and the impact of his report and about how it fits in with his work more generally. We invite audience members to submit any questions by clicking on the Q&A button on your screen. But first, just a bit of background about our guest. Dr. Ahmed Shaheed is Deputy Director of the Human Rights Center and lecturer at the University of Essex in the United Kingdom, as well as Senior Fellow at the Raoul Wallenberg Human Rights Center in Canada. Since 2016, he served as the UN Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Religion and Belief, having previously been the UN Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in Iran. He served as a diplomat for the Maldives for more than 25 years, including as Minister of Foreign Affairs. Dr. Shaheed is also the founding chair of the Geneva-based think tank, the Universal Rights Group. In 2015, he was awarded the Leo Nevis Human Rights Award by the United Nations Foundation for his work to advance human rights nationally and internationally. Dr. Shaheed, thank you so much for spending some time with us today.
Thank you, Mr. Mariaschin, for this very generous introduction and also the kind invitation to join you this morning for you and afternoon for me. Talk about the issues of mutual interest and, of course, common interest to all of us in the audience.
Well, to begin, let's talk about not the issues, because we will get to the issues shortly, but let's talk about your upbringing in the Maldives and how it led to your work in human rights and diplomacy.
Interesting question. I am from the Maldives, which is a long, long way away from where either of us are at the moment. But growing up in the 70s, I grew up in a house of a judge. My father was a judge. My uncle was a judge. My father's friends were judges. So I grew up in a household of judges. So justice became a very important, if you like, idea for me. And being just, being fair, weighing evidence, being forthright, all of that was part of my, I suppose, upbringing. So that was with me all throughout. But my choice of being a diplomat was not of my own. The government in the Maldives decides where one goes as a career, almost like a draft of sorts. But very early on in my work in Foreign Office, I came to New York. I was posted to the UN mission in New York as an 18-year-old. So it was quite an experience for me. I spent 2 years in New York, and I quite liked the multilateral, if you like, settings of the UN. On going back, I was assigned to look at the South Asian region, traveling extensively from Bangladesh, India, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Sri Lanka, Nepal, Bhutan, the entire region, just doing round and round and round so much, talking to diplomats about fostering cooperation amongst a very troubled region. So these things kind of, stayed with me. And when I came out of the Maldives, my first instinct, of course, was to look at setting up a think tank that can make the work of the UN more transparent to others, so that the Geneva-based think tank Universal Rights Group is to create that bridge between civil society actors and the UN system. And of course, having quit the Maldives following a coup in which I had to flee as a refugee, I came to the UK. At that time, I just begun my first year as a UN rapporteur on covering Iran. And this was part of the reason why I had to leave the country. My reports were critical of the government of Iran, critical of its theocratic rule. So that didn't stand me in good standing with the new government. So having made that journey, I've stayed with my UN work for the past 10 years.
Well, mentioning the position you held as Special Rapporteur on Iran, I mean, perhaps we could start with that as one of the issues. You were the rapporteur from 2011 to 2016, and it goes without saying that Iran draws a great deal of attention from us for a number of reasons. But its government policies at home and abroad, of course, have caused significant concern. What were some of your findings on Iran, certainly also relevant to your current mandate on freedom of religion or belief? And how was the report received by Iran's leadership?
I'll go a little bit further back than that. In my time as foreign minister, I had the opportunity of contributing, responding to the calls by Iranian civil society to create a UN mandate, as the Maldives was a member of the Human Rights Council. So in that capacity, the Maldives was supporting the creation of the mandate, largely in response to the 2009 elections in Iran, followed by a huge crackdown on civil liberties in the country. But Iran is seen as a huge problem, not just people in the country, but in the region and much broader as well. So it began with that. But then it was quite an accident that once it was created, that I had to take it up. It was totally not linked to having the mandate created and me taking it up. But once I took it up, obviously I wasn't allowed to travel to Iran. They refused to let me into the country, which is not the protocol for the UN doing this. But I was able to speak to people in the country using Skype and other technological means of accessing people in the country safely, and to travel around, the communities where the Iranians live as diaspora, like in US, Canada, parts of UK, and elsewhere, and really dig deep into what's happening in the country. I was very concerned about the use of the death penalty in the country. All my reports consistently speak about the spike at the time of the death penalty. In 2009, there were about, I think, less than 100 executions, at least documented. But then rose very sharply to about 1,000 in the next 5-6 years. And of course, that's only what you can document. So that was one element, the use of death penalty for a wide range of offenses which are not permissible under international law for the application of capital punishment. That was one. The other was discrimination, using religion as a rule, as a pathway to discriminate on all sorts of grounds. If you read the Constitution, after the first few lines, you realize the Baha'i are non-persons. They're not recognized in the country's Constitution. Of course, Baha'i fares a further, if you like, cause for hatred, because a Baha'i center is located in Israel, and there's an association of accusing Baha'i of being disloyal to the government, to the state, and the anti-Semitic hatred of the regime is put on the Baha'i as well. And then, of course, there is the treatment of the minorities. Already in a hierarchy, it sets up the Shia Jafri as the norm. Sunnis are tolerated, and then others may be also tolerated, so long as they stay in their space, as it were. So this was quite a huge problem. And of course, a hierarchy on gender, women are suppressed, quite significantly. And then the contracting space or lack of space for civil society to operate. Very brutal crackdowns on free speech, on association, on assembly, really creating very serious concerns about people in the country and its neighborhood. I also wrote about the Jewish communities, the Christian communities in the country. And of course, although the government, when it went order which to demonstrate to me the community were okay. It was evident from empirical terms that the community was dying. In other words, migration has diminished the community's number, and there were other restrictions on the community. But what was happening was what was at once perhaps the second or largest community of Jews outside of Israel, the Middle East, had now become, something, just a faint shadow of what that was. So this was a concern for me as well. So there were numerous concerns, but a lot of it was based upon the use of religion as a rule to suppress rights of other people, denying equality.
Thank you. David, why don't you jump in here?
Sure. Well, thanks, Dan, and thank you again so much, Dr. Shaheed, for being with us. Shifting to that report of yours on anti-Semitism, that groundbreaking report, I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about how it came to be and what the impetus for the report was.
Right. When I took on the mandate now 4 years back, I checked what we've been doing, the past 30 years the mandate's been around. And there's something called the communications database. That is the number of letters we sent out to governments about rights violations. I noticed only a handful, maybe 3, 4, there were thousands, of course, but only 2 or 3 had Jewish individuals as the beneficiaries of a communication. In other words, the system wasn't using its communication tools to advocate for Jewish rights. Maybe there weren't complaints received by the rapporteur, but the situation is clearly quite egregious. And then on country reports, country visits, when rapporteurs travel to various countries, again, I found very few references to Jewish community. There'll be a paragraph about what the Jewish community said to a rapporteur visiting them. So clearly, there wasn't attention paid to the plight of Jews in the UN system. And contrast this with the Council does annually, 3 times a year, debate in Israel, and then so on and so forth. So for me, this was quite unacceptable, that the mandate ought to speak to all communities, must address all concerns, and we were lacking engagement with Jewish communities. So I need to engage with the communities to see why this was the case, why weren't they using the system, or why weren't system supporting them. And then the next is I began to observe that not only was anti-Semitism on the rise even at that time, but I noticed a very high correlation between violence and anti-Semitism. In other words, of course, hatred comes in all forms, many forms, and many also become violent. But I found a very high correlation between anti-Semitism and violent acts. And this was a concern for me because the mandate is tied on to a declaration of 1981 on eliminating discrimination, violence on the basis of religion or belief. And its origin actually goes back to what we call the swastika epidemic of 1959-1960. So what began as a concern about anti-Semitism dropped anti-Semitism from its coverage down the line. So for me, this was an anomaly or a problem. So I began talking to various, Jewish community human rights defenders, and try to build a working relationship with these communities and then engage with the community. And my commitment to the community was, I want to examine the problems, but I want to do it with the community so I have a better understanding of what the problems are and have a report that actually made sense, resonated with the concerns the community has. That's why I came to you and your colleagues in Canada and the US as I was doing my research for the report to have a better engagement with the community. I think the impact has been, for me, quite helpful because what I liked most about it was the fact that the communities embraced the report. I mean, my nightmare would have been, I do a report for the UN on anti-Semitism and the communities have a problem with it. But I found by and large communities are very supportive of my recommendations and my findings. That was a big boost for me because then I can then tell my UN colleagues they have to take this seriously. So the next step was to get the UN, wider UN, to take this more seriously. I'm pleased that the Secretary General has appointed a high-level focal point in his office, Under Secretary General, to look at system issues in the UN on anti-Semitism. That's one element. I also sought to remind countries of the importance of endorsing the IHRA working definition, the IHRA working definition, because without knowing what the phenomenon is, states will be unable to really to act upon this. So I'm not saying my report has done this, but I've seen a number of countries embrace the definition since my report is out. 12 countries have done so. But more importantly, they also need to be disseminating it locally, training people on what this means. So there's more awareness about how to implement the working definition as well. I'm also pleased that there is a growing number of countries appointing national coordinators. Canada has an envoy. Many other countries now have envoys specially dedicated to combating anti-Semitism, as does some of the other European organizations like the Council of Europe. So all of these focus on the issue is something I really welcome. And I'm hoping that by focusing on the recommendations like on education and so on and so forth, we could make some inroads. And over the past 12 months, the coronavirus, the COVID-19 pandemic, has told everybody how we must constantly keep on battling this scourge. And it's a global problem we have to keep on addressing. So that's the reasons for doing the report. And if you like, what's happened since in terms of my own engagement with the subject.
As you noted, the UN hasn't been particularly known to prioritize the fight against anti-Semitism over the years. And in fact, over the course of the last several tenures of Secretaries General of the UN, we've seen, at least at the end of some of those terms, an acknowledgement of that unfortunate fact. Periodically over the course of the UN's history, we've seen some state leaders or diplomats express offensive sentiment in UN fora. You mentioned the statistical mistreatment of Israel, or harsher treatment of Israel than other countries at the UN. And of course, this year is the 20th anniversary of the notorious Durban Conference on Racism, which hosted some scenes and expressions of anti-Semitism and certainly anti-Zionism. To what extent did your report grapple with any anti-Jewish manifestations within multilateral organizations themselves, like the UN?
Right. Okay. My report has a very strict word limit, 10,000 words, and beyond that I can't do much. So I had to prioritize what I can maximally do with it. So I didn't really take head on the UN system, bias towards Jews. But I have spoken a lot about this, including this morning. In fact, calling the Council quite scandalous in the way it's treating, issues linked to Jewish interests, and calling on for a special focal point in the SG's office is a good starting point. And I've been saying they have to go beyond this, including training UN staff on the working definition of anti-Semitism. And the thing is to recognize UN is an umbrella term for a variety of bodies configured in a variety of ways. I'm also part of the UN in a way, although I'm independent of it. But I'm one of 50 rapporteurs who cover a range of issues. So we are independent and we can choose topics as we wish. I couldn't have been able to choose anti-Semitism as a topic for study if it required approval by numbers, as it were, in a voting body of the UN. That's because the political bodies of the UN are quite biased in this matter. But there are other parts of it, like secretariats of the UN. I put UNESCO here. UNESCO's political bodies may have bias, possibly do have bias, but its secretariat officials have units of work in education, working very fruitfully on combating anti-Semitism. And likewise, there are other bits and pieces within the UN system which can be mobilized to support that. The key thing would be to use these things we have, as it were, allies we have in the UN system, to push back against those perpetrators who keep on using frames of racism, as you refer to in Durban, to push back against Israel and Jews through anti-Semitism. I do speak about, I spend a lot of time on the working definition. Therefore, I do raise the issue of rejection of Zionism as a problem. Equating Zionism with racism is a problem. I call that out. I talk about unfair treatment of Israel as a form of anti-Semitism. I mentioned that. And of course, they do come from the Council. Now, I chose the General Assembly as the forum where I present my report. That's quite a strategic decision, because having some 195 members there, almost the world body there, was easier than going into the Geneva context, where 3 times a year there's Israel bashing going on. So, of course, my final report to the Council will be next year, March, and I intend to come to the Council with a report on anti-Semitism. In other words, what's happened since my report was published. And in that, I'll be looking at what the UN itself has done with regard to tackling issues of anti-Semitism. So I'm not putting back, as it were, just measuring how I do this.
Let's go back to the report a little bit. You called on the Secretary General specifically to appoint a senior level focal point in his executive office to monitor anti-Semitism and the response of the UN to it. And indeed, Secretary General Guterres did in fact designate Miguel Moratinos, the High Representative for the UN Alliance of Civilizations, whom we know very well as a former Foreign Minister of Spain, former Special Envoy in Europe for the peace process, with whom we had a discussion just a couple of weeks ago. Did this designation satisfy exactly what you had in mind? And again, just to follow up a little bit on your previous answer, do you believe that he will be empowered to intensify efforts against anti-Semitism? It's extremely important because if we know him well, and we know that he's certainly someone who can do this job, will he have the wherewithal behind him to get the job done?
I'm very pleased that Secretary General appointed an Under-Secretary General in his office, so that met that important criterion that I was looking for. That's important. I also believe that Mr. Mariaschin, given his experience as a diplomat, has the personal skills required and the status required to push UN forward. The question now is whether he can mobilize the UN's resources that he requires to do his job effectively. That's an open question we have to work on, and I think member states have a role here in ensuring that they can support beefing up his capacity to look at the issue. He certainly needs more within the UN system to be able to do his new assignment more effectively. I am working with him. I hope to collaborate with him. I also hope to bring about a further mobilization to enable him to do his very important work. But I think the visibility he brings in the UN system, the credibility he brings as a very expert diplomat in this field, these are all important assets to the way forward. And he's still quite new in his work. So I think we need to support him to make sure that he can deliver on his very important mandate, a very difficult time in terms of the amount of, if you like, challenges that his mandate faces. So I'm optimistic that he can do his mandate, providing the Secretary General gives him the resources required to do so.
Dr. Shaheed, thank you for mentioning the IRA, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance working definition of anti-Semitism. B'nai B'rith had played a role throughout the process in cultivating that definition and honing it. Your report was widely commended, certainly within the Jewish community, for its recommendation that more states, and we've seen quite a few already adopt the IRA definition, but that more states do so. As you said, the definition for some of our viewers who may not be familiar encompasses both some older, more traditional forms of anti-Semitism, ancient stereotypes, to more modern forms like the delegitimization or demonization of Israel, the denial of Israel's right to exist, notwithstanding legitimate political differences, political criticism or points of view. To what extent do you think it is within the UN system, and particularly your orbit in Geneva, where we would have been just over the coming few weeks as B'nai B'rith, if not for the pandemic, to what extent do you think it is recognized or might still be recognized that that Israel as the Jewish state is sometimes an object of anti-Jewish demonization or delegitimization?
I think, well, again, like I said, we should unpack UN Geneva into different bits. So Secretariat, member states, and then, of course, people like me who are the experts, whether in treaty bodies or in the procedure systems. So we really need to look at these different parts in a different fashion. And I think within these special rapporteurs, it'll be easier to get recognition for the working definition. Although there is one mandate fixed permanently on Israel. But again, having a mandate in Israel is not of itself a problem, so long as that person on the job understands that what the working definition is trying to do here. Because legitimate criticism of what a government does is never a problem. As a rights defender, I could never say any government ought to get a free pass for what they do. It's all of us, even our own governments, we need to hold them to account. That's not the issue here. The issue is a demonization, as I said, of Israel and singling out and forever keep on bashing Israel through motivations that are anti-Semitic. That's the way it becomes a problem. So I think working with the rapporteurs, it's important. And you would notice last year's Holocaust Remembrance Day statement was issued first time by the UN on Holocaust Remembrance Day, with several rapporteurs joining me in the statement. This year too, many rapporteurs join me, so the coalition building can proceed. So that is one part. And then, of course, within the Secretariat, there's a real need to educate more broadly on what the definition is, because the resistance to definition comes from a misrepresentation of the definition. IRA says up top, this is a non-legally binding working definition. So there was never intention that this becomes hard law. That was never the intention. It's an educational tool which will determine how one looks at various statements. It does say hate speech is quite context specific. So given the context of how something is said, these examples, and there are some 10 or 11 examples here, they may constitute anti-Semitic statements, and often they are. But nevertheless, it does hold up the prospect that one has to make a very careful assessment of whether or not that particular statement constitutes anti-Semitism. And again, even if it were, it's a different assessment whether or not that's criminal or not, because you can have biased statements. People can make it without facing a legal penalty, because bias can come through ignorance. But at what level do we criminalize that? That's a very high threshold, a threshold of inciting violence and discrimination against another person. That's a high threshold. Below that are all sorts of, if you like, a hate speech, which requires certainly a counter response. We should challenge hateful discourse, even if it didn't incite violence. And then at levels below, there can be just ordinary biased people speak out without even recognizing that. So how we deal with these different forms and types and scale of prejudice is important. And the working definition makes allowance for that flexible way to approach this in line with international standards for doing that. So we can work with the officials on that basis. With member states, I think we have to build more coalition with those who are willing, but also break out of the echo chamber and engage those who've not been willing to date. And I think there are a number of Jewish organizations, a number of governments doing that work, and so as you are, so that by having those conversations, we make these states understand how they're getting it wrong, how they can separate from concerns about what a government does, whether it's Israel or Lebanon or US or wherever, as opposed to constantly bashing a government simply because it exists. And that's not right. So that distinction should be made. Also, the important point, those governments, those delegates who don't make the distinction between proper and legitimate criticism of Israel and anti-Semitic ones actually hurt their own cause, because they delegitimize their own cause by branding everything with an anti-Semitic lens.
Well, we absolutely agree that the IRA working definition is crucial. We needed that baseline. It's actually baseline plus. But also that recognizing both older and newer forms of anti-Semitism is crucial, which we've just discussed. Now, your report critically recognized different sources of contemporary anti-Semitism from the far right, the far left, and also from Islamic extremists. And although arguably more pervasive in other parts of the world, even here in the US, Jews are the number one target of faith-based hate crimes. Strikingly, the so-called QAnon beliefs seem to mimic classic anti-Jewish myths, largely around conspiracies. Over the course of preparing your report, did anything surprise you about the intersectionality of anti-Semitism or the scope of anti-Semitism?
Well, the scope certainly, the scope and intensity certainly came as surprises to me. And of course, what struck me, most was the individual testimonies of survivors of various anti-Semitic, hate incidents. And you can never get past that. But coming from my own country, I've seen a country I grew up in a very, very open situation. I remember, Maldivians, my country, talk about the 1973 Yom Kippur War without any anti-Semitic, bias. People spoke about Mrs. Golda Meir, Mr. Moshe Dayan in equal terms as anybody else. There was no, if you like, no animus in how they were describing. It was a war between states, and it's for leaders trying to sort out a problem. So there was no subtext written to it. But a decade later, the whole country changes, and everything becomes very anti-Semitic. And so there's been a global surge in how anti-Semitism has spread to countries where even there isn't a Jewish population present. This comes on the back of things like the Middle East conflict, how that is presented by various parties. The UN resolution in 1975 declaring Zionism as a form of racism is an important, I think, watershed in making that break between, a world it was a little better and then what was absolutely awful. So these sorts of things have made a world a very, very, very anti-Semitic place. In my time as foreign minister, I tried to create, in fact signed 3 agreements with Israel, one on health collaboration, one on education, and one on technology. The education one faced a lot of pushback in my own country. I was impeached, in fact, for recognizing Israel's existence and for having signed these agreements in the parliament. So I'm aware of how deep these things can go. But having said that, what has stayed most with me are the situation of young children, Jewish children. I went to schools in Europe where you're going to school, all right, because I'm invited to go to school. I don't see a school. I see lots of, it's like a prison. And as you walk in, there's so much security outside, so much security inside. To have 4-year-olds, 5-year-olds, 6-year-olds, and go up the age gap, live in what looks like a prison to me is shocking, right? To have children go to a school that doesn't look like a school but looks like a prison because security needs is absolutely unacceptable. And then I hear tales of how when they travel to come to school on train, or these are quite advanced economies. They come on, fast trains, they travel on time and all of that. But they tell me about the kind of abuse they go through in those trains, or the abuse they meet from their peers on the streets. So the street level, the extent to which this have permeated society was absolutely, for me, shocking. When I'm discovering these in countries where people generally uphold, democracy, pluralism, and all these, great values that uphold the human rights standards. That was quite jarring for me to have that, if you like, the difference between democracy for all of us, but excluding Jews from that consideration, even at young children who are going to school.
Yeah, that's a very good point. But your point about the Zionism racism resolution being a watershed moment in terms of the shift in terms of contemporary anti-Semitism. There's no question that really was an important moment. Just to follow up a little bit on what you just said, your report rightly emphasized that anti-Semitism is toxic to democracy, and that whether taking the form of government discrimination, individual acts of criminality, or hostility online, it poses a threat not only to Jews but to other communities. I think a lot of people don't realize that there is you can connect the dots. It may start with Jews, it doesn't end with Jews. The report made recommendations on tracking and combating anti-Semitism to states, to civil society, and to the media. What's been the response to those recommendations, and what progress, if any, have you already seen, and where can the greatest resistance to change be found?
Right. I think, again, I am only speaking here of things that happened since. I'm not attributing any to my report because, I don't think the report was the cause of this. But there have been, say, if you look at the UK, for example, there's been some positive developments in the UK. There's been a special envoy appointed, Lord Mann, to monitor anti-Semitism in the UK. And he's done great work. He's done great work reaching out to football clubs, the idea of peer-to-peer engagement on this. And then he's also done great work within the parliament in getting his own peers in the parliament to recognize what the issues are. So there's been, at the national level, more and more countries have been willing to engage on the problem, document the incidence of the issue of anti-Semitism, and responding to that. So that's been going very well. Online too, I've been engaging with some of the media companies in this area, and there have been some positive developments. I recognize them in my last statement on Holocaust remembrance this year, where some media companies have been willing to combat disinformation that target the Holocaust denial information, are now either removed or carry a warning or are directed elsewhere. So these sorts of ways of tackling online hate speech is important. Of course, it's slow, still a lot of work to be done. It has a lot of resistance, but again, it's been a good beginning, and we need to push that. On civil society also, there's been some positive developments, but there is the narrative that comes from linked with the Durban aftermath, the overflow of the Durban, the counter-racism frame, using the frame of racism to mount racist attacks on Jews. That's what it amounts to. So part of the BDS movement have, along with it, in its margins, people who've actually used quite flagrant anti-Semitic tropes. That is a problem. A bigger problem are actually those in power. We've seen very powerful political figures, in high office in many countries, use their political office to incite hatred towards Jews. And it's not only Jews, it's again towards everybody else. As it begins perhaps with Jews, but then quickly goes to other people. The pandemic has seen, another pandemic, a pandemic of anti-Semitism, one could say. As it rolled on, first began with the Asians because of the initial location of the virus, but then quickly became something very anti-Semitic, scapegoating, conspiracy theories, blaming Israel for the virus, accusing it of concocting the virus or whatever. And it came on social media, came on mainstream media, came on sermons. It just went on quite viral in that sense. So civil society still remains very much tied to this sort of vulnerability, to this sort of incitement by people in high office, and that's something we have to address. But there's been, I think, good reason to be optimistic, simply because there is now a momentum on countries trying to address the issue. More and more countries committing resources, more and more countries committing envoys, more and more countries committing documenting the data and talking about the problem. That is a good start.
Is there any follow-up planned at the UN, do you think, to your report on anti-Semitism? Might there be new reports written? Is there any sense of this being a periodic review, if you will?
I hope it does become that. I have a maximum of 6 years on this mandate, so I'll have to sign off end of next year. And I have already announced that I will have a final report. What's happened since my report presented to the Council. My hope is that this becomes a regular feature in the mandate. So when my mandate comes up for review next year, I'm hoping countries would ask the mandate also to look at issues of anti-Semitism. So that becomes a regular issue that's reported on. That's something easy to do, and I think some countries will push for that. But beyond that, there's a need to mainstream our efforts to combat anti-Semitism. Now, there are many UN fora where they talk about racism, they talk about forms of hatred, but very often they don't think, anti-Semitism or Jewish communities are part of the conversation. We have to make that also happen. As an example would be in later this next month, in March this year, we'll have the 10th anniversary of what is called the Resolution 1618. It's the landmark resolution where the UN decided how it will act on combating incitement to violence, discrimination, stigmatization, and negative stereotyping of people based on their religious identity. And it's been seen primarily as a tool to address anti-Muslim hatred, but it must also be seen as a tool to address all forms of hatred, and anti-Semitism is part of this. So I'm hoping that this conversation will also bring in Jewish communities as legitimate parties to this conversation. So there's more mainstreaming of combating anti-Semitism as well. I have a colleague in the rapporteur system, the rapporteur on racism, who has a mandate to look at anti-Semitism, and she does that. She had a report on anti-Semitism roughly the same time as I had a report on anti-Semitism, but her brief is more neo-Nazism and so more Europe-focused than the global focus that I took in my report.
Dr. Shaheed, Dan had mentioned a little bit earlier anti-Semitism in Islamist circles. Sadly, Pew Forum, and you made reference to this as well, Pew Forum and other surveys have found stunningly high rates of anti-Jewish sentiment in many, not all, but many Muslim majority societies. And this, I think, as someone engaged in intercommunal and interreligious engagement, this is something especially tragic considering all of the commonalities, theological, historical, cultural, and otherwise between Jews and Muslims. This said, the Abraham Accords have now widened the circle of peace and potential mutual exposure in the Middle East. And on the more negative side in Europe, I think it's fair to say that both Muslims and Jews face shared threats, xenophobia, but also specifically efforts to prohibit male circumcision and the religiously mandated preparation of meat, kosher or halal slaughter. Do you see any new possibilities here, any new avenues for Muslim-Jewish rapprochement and cooperation?
Absolutely. It's a very important question, David, this one. In my report, I don't have enough space to really examine in detail extent to which Muslim majority states have anti-Semitism in their grassroots or other ways. But I do refer to the problem as one to be examined. I think there should be more engagement on this issue because ultimately all this rests down to intolerance, conspiracy theories, and a very negative attitude towards the other, and leave out the question of Jews. Their own societies cannot progress without respect for pluralism and diversity that they require. And to do that, they need to address the issue. And it comes from many sources. Some of it comes from radical interpretations of doctrine that exists. It also comes from politics of the Middle East, again overlaid with the 75 UN resolution. It comes with imported colonial type anti-Semitism from a previous time. Things like the reference to the Protocol of the Elders of Zion and so on and so forth. All these are mixed and matched and used by populist politicians to drive certain exclusionary agendas. So this has to be engaged even to make these societies themselves respect values of pluralism and democracy. They all need to thrive and prosper. That's just one element. The other is what this does to other people, what this does to Jewish communities online and UN fora elsewhere. So we have to confront this, have a real good conversation about this. Look at school books. There's a recent study of Iranian school books, and I am working with other countries, looking at what they do. And if you have this in the school books, that creates new generations of anti-Semites, as it were, in those countries. But not just anti-Semites, they create bigots. That's what they're preparing. And then you're right, in European context, you again find the contradiction. In migrant communities of Muslims, there is the imported, or they bring back from their home or whatever, the anti-Semitism, overlaid with their own, if you like, on other forms of racism. But reality is, as you point out, in the Abrahamic Accords and elsewhere, there's a common challenge people of faith face to begin with in a world of secularization, as it were, of a militant sort. People of all faiths face a problem. That's one element. And there is a problem faced by the Abrahamic religions, as it were, and especially Jews and Muslims. And you mentioned two things about halal food and male circumcision. Sometimes these moves come as a way to target the Muslim communities more than, I think, Jewish communities. Certainly, they don't come from anti-Semitic motivations, I don't think, at least the most recent ones. But they have the impact of imposing, an impossible challenge to Jewish communities and to Muslim communities. So there is a need to work together. There are groups working together already. That's hope in that. But we have demonstrated to them that we have a common challenge. The bigot can exist anywhere, and that's a threat to everyone. And anti-Semitism, as the oldest form of hatred, is an alarm bell. I've called it the canary in the coal mine of hatred. It is almost the first one to go out, and it's an alarm bell for everybody. The pandemic, like I said, showed that. So there is, I think, a growing appetite, a growing willingness, a growing space for that collaboration to happen amongst Jewish and Muslim communities. And you're absolutely right. Muslim societies have to face the anti-Semitism they breed either through their own hateful preaching or from the politics of the Middle East they import and then make worse to their own communities. I hope to be able to talk about this in more detail in my final report to the UN.
Well, we have time really for one more question, Dr. Shaheed, and that would be, what are you working on now? What are you preparing as it relates to other communities, other faith communities, and the important work that you do?
Thank you very much. I just signed off a report on anti-Muslim hatred and or Islamophobia, depending on how one wants to frame that. And this looks at how Muslim communities around the world, even in their own countries, face hatred, either within Muslim majority-minority context or when they live in a society where there are minorities. Again, the point is to highlight the impacts of such hatred and ways of combating them. I'm also working with other parts of the UN Office on Genocide Prevention, who have the mandate of the UN Secretary General's Hate Speech Action Plan on how we can roll that out globally, looking at how we combat hate speech affects everybody more generally. My future report into the Council will include a look at the minorities in all sorts of settings for this September. And then for next year, March, I'll have a report on anti-Semitism and another one that looks at freedom of thought in an age of emerging technologies. So I'm looking at how disinformation, how algorithms, how use of online technologies, they're all affecting our scope to think for ourselves, to think freely, how that amounts to a violation of our human rights to religious freedom. And my very final report will be next year, September, and I hope to have a review of what I've been able to do, and then perhaps suggest areas in which, based on good practice, we could do more. Thank you.
Dan, do we have a few questions? Do we have time for one from the audience?
Yes. Do we have one up there? Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So we have a few, but Dr. Shaheed, one of our viewers writes on Muslim Jewish relations. As we mentioned, a growing number of Muslim countries are now normalizing their relations with Israel. It was reported today that Israel plans to send several thousand COVID-19 vaccine doses to a variety of countries, including Mauritania and the Maldives. Coming from your privileged perch, you had mentioned your personal experience with relations between Israel and the Maldives. We know that ties, at least formally, were cut off at a certain point. What are the prospects for full diplomatic relations between the Maldives and Israel?
I think 100%. I've always maintained that we have never severed ties with Israel. What happened, I say it, it's on the parliament as well. What happened was when the UN passed a resolution in 1975, calling equator Zionism with racism, and then the non-aligned movement, which was the leader in this, which began this work, met in Sri Lanka the following year. And for Sri Lanka to host that summit, it meant the embassy in Israel had to leave. And so when the embassy in Sri Lanka, which was covered in the Maldives, left the region, we had no contact. In fact, the very first ambassador to be received by the independent Maldives was the ambassador of Israel to the Maldives. That is a privilege we have, and we hope to keep coming back to that. I think we should be able to restore full ties with Israel. And I look forward to that day. I think the countries that fail to do so are missing a major point, that they cannot have a dialogue with any government with whom they don't have that relationship. If they have a problem, talk to the government, not talk at the government. And that's an important message they all need to hear.
Well, that's an encouraging note on which to end our conversation today. Unfortunately, we've run out of time, but Dr. Shaheed, it has been a privilege to have you with us. And thank you for taking the time to join us and for your timely and urgent work. And really, we wish you all the best going forward.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Well, I want to thank Ahmed Shaheed, UN Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Religion or Belief, for being with us today, and my colleague, David Michaels. Through partnership in defense of religious freedom for all communities, we're confident that a better, more peaceful world can truly be secured for future generations. A recording of this conversation will shortly be available on demand on our YouTube channel. I want to thank all of you for joining us today, and I hope that you'll return for future discussions. Until then, please take care and continue to be well. We look forward to seeing you again soon.